The invitation arrived unexpectedly, a thick, elegant card embossed with swirling silver letters. Jared's eyes scanned the text, feeling a knot of unease tightening in his chest. It was from Emily, his close friend, inviting him to a high-profile party. The location was clear, a rooftop ballroom in New York City, a place that promised glitz, glamour, and, unfortunately, old faces. He hesitated, thinking of the last time he had seen Sebastian, the man who had been more than just a thorn in his side. He could already feel the flood of emotions threatening to crash over him. The evening of the party arrived, and Jared found himself standing in front of a grand building, the entrance aglow with golden lights. He took a deep breath, straightened his jacket, and stepped inside. The opulence of the venue was striking, chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a warm glow over the elegantly dressed guests. Music filled the air, a slow, sultry jazz that made every movement seem more languid, more deliberate. He weaved through the crowd, nodding to familiar faces, his nerves fraying as he anticipated what, or rather, who, he might find here. Then he saw him. Standing near the bar, his back turned, was Sebastian. The sight of him made Jared's heart skip a beat, a blend of anger and something else, something he couldn't quite name, surging within him. Sebastian turned, and their eyes locked. For a moment, it felt as if the room had emptied, leaving just the two of them in the hazy glow of chandeliers. Jared's heart pounded in his chest, his throat tightening. Sebastian's expression was unreadable, his lips curling into a faint, knowing smile as he began to make his way toward Jared. "Jared," Sebastian greeted, his voice smooth and warm, yet carrying an edge of something else. "It's been a long time." Jared swallowed, forcing himself to maintain a neutral expression. "Sebastian, I didn't expect to see you here." Sebastian chuckled softly, a sound that sent shivers down Jared's spine. "Emily has a way of bringing people together, doesn't she?" His gaze was intense, his eyes scanning Jared's face as if searching for something familiar, something lost. Jared struggled to hold onto his composure, the memories of their last encounter threatening to break free. He opened his mouth to reply, but before he could find the right words, Sebastian gestured toward the dance floor. "Shall we dance? For old time's sake." Jared hesitated, his instinct screaming to refuse, to walk away and keep the past buried. But there was a pull in Sebastian's eyes, an unspoken challenge that stirred something deep within him. Against his better judgment, he nodded. Sebastian's smile widened, and he extended his hand. The music swirled around them as they stepped onto the dance floor. The touch of Sebastian's hand against his own was electrifying, a reminder of the complex emotions that had always simmered between them. They moved together, each step a silent exchange, each glance a question left unanswered. Jared could feel his resolve weakening, the anger and resentment melting into something far more dangerous. "You look good," Sebastian said softly, his voice barely audible over the music. "Better than I remember." Jared felt his cheeks warm, and he cursed himself for the reaction. "Is this your way of apologizing?" He shot back, trying to keep his tone light, though he could hear the bitterness seeping through. Sebastian's eyes darkened, and for a moment, Jared saw a flicker of regret, a crack in the confident mask he always wore. "Maybe," Sebastian admitted, "or maybe it's my way of saying I've missed you." Jared's heart skipped a beat, a storm of emotion swirling inside him. He wanted to believe Sebastian, to let himself be drawn into the warmth of his words. But the past loomed like a dark shadow, whispering caution. "You don't get to just walk back into my life and say that," he replied, his voice trembling slightly. Sebastian's grip on his hand tightened, a silent plea passing between them. "I know I don't," he said quietly. "But I'm here now. And I'm not going to let you go this time." They danced in silence for a moment, the tension between them growing thicker with each step. Jared felt the walls he had built around his heart starting to crumble, a crack allowing old memories and feelings to seep through. When the song ended, they stood still, breathless and uncertain, their hands still intertwined. "Let's go somewhere quieter," Sebastian suggested, his voice a mix of confidence and vulnerability. Jared hesitated, his instincts warning him to turn away. But the need for answers, for closure, or perhaps something more, pushed him to nod. They found a secluded corner, away from the noise and prying eyes. As they settled into the privacy, Sebastian's expression grew serious. "I know I hurt you," he began, his voice raw. "But you need to know that it wasn't because I hated you." It was because I didn't know how to handle what I felt for you. Jared blinked, taken aback by the admission. He had braced himself for excuses, deflections, but not this. What are you saying? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sebastian sighed, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration. I'm saying I was in love with you, Jared. I was too afraid to admit it back then, so I pushed you away. I thought it would make things easier, but it only made everything worse. Jared felt his world tilt on its axis, the ground beneath him shifting as he processed Sebastian's words. Love. The one thing he had never expected to hear. Anger and confusion clashed within him, but so did a dangerous glimmer of hope. You can't just say that now, he muttered, turning away to hide the tears threatening to spill from his eyes. Not after all these years. Sebastian stepped closer, his presence warm and insistent. I know, he murmured. But I had to tell you. I need you to understand why I acted the way I did. He paused, his eyes searching Jared's face. And I need you to know that I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for a chance to make things right. Jared swallowed hard, the weight of Sebastian's words pressing down on him. Part of him wanted to walk away, to protect himself from the pain that had defined their past. But another part, the part that had never stopped thinking about Sebastian, yearned for the possibility of something new, something real. Fine, he said at last, his voice shaky. But don't think I'm just going to forget everything overnight. A flicker of relief crossed Sebastian's face, followed by a soft, genuine smile. I wouldn't expect you to, he replied. I'm willing to work for this. For us. As the night wore on, they continued to talk, exploring the edges of their past and the possibilities of their future. It was messy and complicated, filled with heated arguments and tender moments. Yet, as dawn approached, Jared found himself standing closer to Sebastian, the fear in his heart slowly being replaced by a fragile hope. When they finally left the party, hand in hand, Jared knew that this was just the beginning. Their story was far from over, but for the first time, he was ready to embrace the twists and turns ahead. As the days passed following the party, Jared couldn't shake the encounter with Sebastian from his mind. His emotions were a whirlwind of confusion, anger, and an undeniable sense of longing. It had been years since they had seen each other, but in one evening, Sebastian had managed to unravel everything Jared had carefully built around his heart. He tried to focus on his daily life, throwing himself into work, but even in the busiest moments, Sebastian's words echoed in his thoughts. Then, it began. The first sign of Sebastian's pursuit came in the form of a simple bouquet of roses left on Jared's doorstep. There was no note, just the fragrance of fresh blooms and the familiarity of Sebastian's silent, persistent charm. Jared stared at the flowers for a long moment, torn between the urge to throw them away and the sudden warmth they brought. Against his better judgment, he placed them in a vase on the windowsill, a reluctant reminder of the man who was slowly worming his way back into his life. Sebastian was not the type to give up easily. Over the next few days, Jared found himself receiving texts, each one more personal than the last. There were no grand declarations of love, no apologies in words. Instead, Sebastian sent small, thoughtful messages, a recommendation for Jared's favorite coffee place, a link to a new song that he thought Jared might like, even a suggestion for a book that he knew Jared had been eyeing for months. It was infuriating how well he knew Jared, even after all this time. One evening, Jared found himself standing in front of a quaint, quiet cafe. It was one of those places Sebastian had mentioned in his texts, a hidden gem in the city, tucked away from the usual bustle of New York. He had intended to go somewhere else, to ignore Sebastian's suggestion out of spite. Yet, here he was. He took a deep breath and stepped inside, the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee enveloping him as he did. He didn't expect to find Sebastian sitting at a corner table, casually sipping from a steaming mug. For a brief moment, Jared considered turning around and leaving, but Sebastian caught his eye, a faint smile curving his lips. Jared, he called out, his voice carrying just the right amount of surprise and warmth. Fancy meeting you here, Jared cursed internally. Of course, Sebastian would be here. He made his way over, his steps slow and deliberate. I could say the same, Jared replied, taking the seat opposite him. Though I have a feeling you knew I'd show up. Sebastian's smile widened, but he didn't deny it. Maybe, he admitted. But I'm glad you did. There was a sincerity in his voice that disarmed Jared, and he hated how easily his defenses crumbled around this man. They ordered coffee, and for a while, they sat in comfortable silence, the hum of the cafe providing a soothing backdrop to their thoughts. Sebastian seemed content to wait, his gaze steady on Jared, allowing him the time to collect his scattered emotions. Finally, Jared broke the silence. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his tone harsher than he intended. "Why now, after all these years?" Sebastian took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes never leaving Jared's face. "Because I've realized that some things are worth fighting for," he replied softly. "And because I made a mistake by walking away from you before. I won't make that mistake again." Jared felt his chest tighten at the words. He wanted to be angry, to hold on to the bitterness of their past, but the sincerity in Sebastian's eyes made it difficult. "You think you can just swoop back into my life and expect me to forgive everything?" he challenged, his voice trembling slightly. "No," Sebastian said quietly, setting his cup down. "I don't expect forgiveness. I'm here to earn your trust again, one step at a time." Jared studied him, searching for any hint of insincerity, but found none. For the first time, he allowed himself to truly look at Sebastian, to see the man he had become rather than the one he remembered. There was a maturity in his gaze, a quiet strength that hadn't been there before. It was unsettling, and yet, it tugged at something deep inside Jared, something he had long buried. They continued to talk, cautiously at first, like two people navigating a minefield. The conversation drifted from the past to the present, to their lives since they had parted ways. Jared found himself laughing at Sebastian's stories, feeling the tension between them ease into something softer, something that felt almost like hope. As they left the cafe, Sebastian reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against Jared's arm. "There's a place I want to show you," he said, his voice low and earnest. "It's a bit of a walk, but I think you'll like it." Jared hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. Every instinct screamed at him to pull away, to protect himself from the whirlwind of emotions threatening to engulf him. But the look in Sebastian's eyes, filled with quiet anticipation and a hint of vulnerability, made him nod. "Lead the way," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. They walked through the city, the evening air cool against their skin. Sebastian didn't speak, and Jared found comfort in the silence. It was as if words were unnecessary, the closeness between them saying everything they couldn't. After a while, they arrived at a small, secluded park. It was quiet, the only sounds the rustling of leaves and the distant hum of traffic. Sebastian led him to a bench under an old oak tree, its branches arching protectively over them. "This is my thinking spot," Sebastian confessed, sitting down and gesturing for Jared to join him. "Whenever I'm overwhelmed or need to make a decision, I come here. It's peaceful." Jared sat beside him, feeling a strange sense of calm settle over him. "I can see why," he murmured, glancing around. "It's nice." They sat there for a while, the weight of their shared history hanging in the air between them. Sebastian turned to face Jared, his expression serious. "I know I have no right to ask this," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "But would you consider giving me a chance to prove that I've changed? To show you that I want more than just to relive our past?" Jared's heart ached at the raw honesty in Sebastian's voice. He looked away, staring at the ground as he struggled with his own emotions. He wanted to say no, to walk away and never look back. But the thought of losing this, of losing Sebastian, made his chest constrict painfully. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "I don't know if I can trust you again." Sebastian reached out, gently tilting Jared's chin up so their eyes met. "I'm not asking you to trust me right away," he said softly. "I'm asking you to let me try to earn it." Jared searched his face, seeing the vulnerability and hope that lay beneath the surface. It was a risk, he knew. Letting Sebastian back into his life meant opening himself up to the possibility of pain, of heartbreak. But it also meant opening himself up to the possibility of something beautiful, something real. "Okay," he whispered, his heart pounding. "But don't expect this to be easy." Sebastian's lips curved into a soft, genuine smile, his eyes shining with unspoken promises. "I wouldn't want it to be," he replied. "The best things in life never are." They sat there in silence, the night settling around them. For the first time in years, Jared felt a spark of hope ignite within him. This was just the beginning, the first step on a path filled with uncertainties. But as he looked at Sebastian, he felt a warmth spreading through him, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, this time, things could be different. The days that followed were a whirlwind of tentative exploration and delicate steps toward rebuilding what once was, or perhaps, building something entirely new. Jared found himself navigating the strange dance between vulnerability and guardedness, each interaction with Sebastian testing the fragile trust that was slowly taking root between them. Sebastian was careful, respectful of Jared's boundaries. He didn't push or rush. Instead, he found small, meaningful ways to show that he was serious. One evening, Jared returned home to find a box on his doorstep. Inside was a collection of his favorite books, each one marked with sticky notes on pages that Sebastian had highlighted with thoughts, questions, and comments. It was a gesture that spoke volumes. Sebastian wasn't just trying to rekindle an old flame, he was trying to understand Jared in the here and now, to be a part of his present, not just his past. Jared hesitated before picking up the first book, his fingers trailing over the worn cover. It was one of his favorites, a novel he had read countless times. Curiosity and a warmth he hadn't felt in years filled him as he flipped open to the first marked page. There, Sebastian had written in his familiar scrawl, "This line reminds me of you. Of the way you used to talk about your dreams." Asterisk. Jared closed his eyes, the words tugging at his heart. He didn't know how to respond to this new version of Sebastian, the thoughtful, patient man who seemed determined to know him deeply. Part of him feared it was a facade, a fleeting charm that would dissolve the moment things got difficult. Yet, another part of him, a part that had been buried under layers of hurt and bitterness, wanted to believe that people could change. Days turned into weeks, and Jared found himself increasingly drawn into Sebastian's orbit. They spent afternoons in coffee shops, sharing stories and revisiting old memories with a mix of laughter and quiet reflection. Sometimes, their conversations turned heated, especially when the shadows of their past loomed too large. But every argument, every moment of tension, was followed by an apology, a gesture of understanding that seemed to bring them closer rather than pushing them apart. One night, Sebastian invited Jared to his apartment. Jared had never been to Sebastian's place before, and the prospect made his heart race with a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. He arrived at the building, a sleek, modern structure in the heart of the city, and took the elevator to the top floor. When the doors opened, Sebastian was waiting, leaning casually against the doorframe, a small smile playing on his lips. "Welcome to my sanctuary," he said, stepping aside to let Jared in. Jared walked in, his eyes scanning the space. It was tastefully decorated, with bookshelves lining the walls, plants adding splashes of green, and art pieces that hinted at a side of Sebastian he hadn't known before. The room felt warm, lived in, and unexpectedly inviting. Sebastian moved to the kitchen, pulling out a bottle of wine. "I thought we could cook together," he said, his tone light but with an undercurrent of nervousness that Jared found oddly endearing. Jared raised an eyebrow. "Cook? You?" he teased, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Sebastian laughed, shaking his head. "I know, hard to believe, right? But I've picked up a few skills since we last, well, you know." There was a pause, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes before he turned back to the counter. "I wanted to do something that's not just about us talking. Something normal." Jared's heart softened at the effort Sebastian was making. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was real, grounded in the simplicity of sharing a moment. "Okay," he said, walking over. "But don't blame me if I take over halfway through." They spent the evening in the kitchen, a surprisingly intimate experience. They bumped into each other, laughed at mistakes, and debated over the right way to sauté vegetables. There were moments when their hands brushed, when Sebastian's laughter filled the air, lightening the tension that sometimes crept in. By the time they sat down to eat, Jared felt a strange mix of contentment and fear, the reality of their situation hovering like a quiet reminder that things weren't as simple as they seemed. As they sipped wine after dinner, a comfortable silence settled over them. It was Sebastian who broke it, his voice soft and reflective. "I've missed this," he said, his eyes fixed on the glass in his hand. "The normalcy. The ease of just being with you." Jared glanced at him, his chest tightening. "It's not always going to be easy, you know," he replied, his tone gentle but firm. "There's still a lot we need to work through." Sebastian nodded, his gaze lifting to meet Jared's. I know, he said quietly. And I'm ready for that. I'm not expecting a fairy tale. I want to be in this with you, whatever it looks like. Jared's heart ached at the sincerity in Sebastian's voice. He wanted to believe, to let himself fall into this new rhythm they were creating. But the fear of history repeating itself held him back. He set his glass down and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. You really hurt me, Sebastian, he said, his voice breaking slightly. And I'm terrified that this, whatever this is, will end the same way. Sebastian's expression softened, and he moved closer, placing a tentative hand on Jared's shoulder. I know I hurt you, he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. And I can't change what happened. But I'm not that person anymore. I've spent so long running from my feelings, from you. I'm done with that. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. Jared felt the sting of tears in his eyes, and he looked away, struggling to maintain his composure. He wanted to trust, to let go of the pain and embrace the possibility of something real. I need time, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Sebastian nodded, his hand sliding down to grasp Jared's. I'll give you all the time you need, he said softly. Just, don't shut me out, okay? Jared squeezed his hand, a silent acknowledgement of the promise he couldn't yet put into words. He took a shaky breath and turned back to face Sebastian, the man who had once been his enemy, now sitting beside him as someone who might just be his greatest love. It was terrifying, exhilarating, and heartbreaking all at once. They sat in silence, holding onto each other, both aware of the road that lay ahead, filled with uncertainty, challenges, and, hopefully, the kind of love that could withstand the storms they had already weathered. For now, this was enough, being here, in this moment, together. In the following weeks, the fragile peace that Jared and Sebastian had found began to blossom into something more tangible. Their interactions became a dance of learning and relearning each other. With every passing day, Jared found himself opening up a bit more, testing the waters of trust. Sebastian, for his part, was patient. Never pushing too far but always being present. He continued with the small gestures, sending thoughtful texts, planning spontaneous outings, leaving little notes that brought a smile to Jared's face. One Saturday morning, Jared woke to the sound of his phone buzzing incessantly on the nightstand. Groggy and a bit annoyed, he reached out and glanced at the screen. It was a text from Sebastian. Get dressed. I have a surprise for you. Jared's heart fluttered at the sight of the message. Surprises were Sebastian's specialty, and they always came with an element of unpredictability. Curious and slightly apprehensive, he got dressed and made his way to the address Sebastian had sent him. It led him to a quiet street in the heart of the city, where a small art gallery stood. As he stepped inside, he was greeted by the soft glow of lights illuminating the various paintings and sculptures that adorned the space. In the center of the room, surrounded by artwork, stood Sebastian, his eyes lighting up as he spotted Jared. Welcome, Sebastian said, gesturing around him. I wanted to show you something. Jared approached cautiously, his gaze moving to a series of paintings displayed along one wall. They were beautiful, each one depicting scenes of nature, cityscapes, and abstract interpretations of emotions. These are amazing, he murmured, unable to tear his eyes away. Sebastian stepped beside him, his voice low and filled with a hint of nervousness. They're mine. I've been working on them for years. Jared turned to face him, surprise and admiration flooding his senses. You did these? He asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. He had never known this side of Sebastian, never imagined him pouring himself into something so artistic, so vulnerable. Sebastian nodded, his gaze fixed on the paintings. Art was my way of dealing with everything, he confessed. All the anger, the confusion, the feelings I had for you. It was the only way I could express what I was going through. Jared felt a lump form in his throat as he stared at the paintings, each brushstroke now carrying a weight he hadn't seen before. Why are you showing me this now? He asked quietly. Sebastian took a deep breath, turning to meet Jared's eyes. Because I want you to see the real me, he said earnestly. Not just the version you knew back then. I've changed, and this is a part of who I am now. Jared's heart ached at the sincerity in Sebastian's words. He could see the vulnerability, the hope in his eyes, and it stirred something deep within him. He stepped closer, his gaze never leaving Sebastian's. You really put everything into this, didn't you? He whispered. Sebastian nodded, his expression softening. I did. And I'm willing to put everything into us, too. If you're willing to give this a chance. Jared felt a surge of emotions, fear, hope, love, all swirling within him. It was terrifying to think of letting his guard down completely, to risk his heart on the man who had once hurt him so deeply. But standing here, surrounded by Sebastian's art, he could see the truth of who he was now. I want to, Jared admitted, his voice trembling slightly. I want to believe that we can have something real. But you have to promise me, Sebastian, no more running, no more hiding. Sebastian reached out, gently taking Jared's hands in his own. I promise, he said firmly, his eyes shining with a mixture of determination and affection. No more running. From now on, I'm here, with you, every step of the way. A warmth spread through Jared's chest as he looked into Sebastian's eyes. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, they could build something lasting. He nodded slowly, a small smile tugging at his lips. Then let's see where this takes us. Sebastian pulled him into a tight embrace, burying his face in Jared's shoulder. Jared closed his eyes, letting himself sink into the moment, into the feeling of being held, of being wanted. It was a small step, but it was theirs. In the days that followed, their relationship shifted into a new phase. There was no longer the lingering uncertainty or the unspoken tension that had shadowed their every move. They began spending more time together, exploring the city, laughing over coffee, and, more importantly, talking, really talking. They shared their dreams, their fears, the things that made them who they were now. The more they learned about each other, the deeper their connection grew. But as they delved into their new normal, life threw them another twist. One evening, as they sat on Sebastian's balcony, gazing out at the city lights, Sebastian's phone rang. He glanced at the screen, his expression shifting into one of concern. It's my family, he muttered, getting up to take the call. Jared watched him walk inside, his heart clenching slightly. The phone call lasted longer than he expected, and when Sebastian finally returned, his face was pale, his eyes troubled. What happened? Jared asked, his voice laced with concern. Sebastian sighed, running a hand through his hair. It's complicated. My parents found out about us, he said, his voice strained. They're not exactly thrilled. Jared felt his stomach drop. He knew Sebastian's family had traditional views, and he had always feared this moment. What did they say? He asked cautiously. They want me to come back home, Sebastian replied, his eyes dark with turmoil. They want to talk, to convince me that this is a mistake. Jared's heart sank. He had known there would be challenges, but this was something he hadn't prepared for. And what are you going to do? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Sebastian stepped closer, his gaze steady. I'm going to tell them that I love you, he said firmly. That this isn't a phase or a mistake. It's real, and I'm not walking away from it. Jared's breath caught in his throat, the words wrapping around his heart like a lifeline. You're sure? He asked, needing to hear it again. Sebastian nodded, his eyes burning with resolve. More than anything, he whispered. I'm not losing you again, Jared. Jared felt a swell of emotion rise within him, a mixture of fear and love so intense that it almost overwhelmed him. He closed the distance between them, wrapping his arms around Sebastian, holding him close. Then we'll face this together, he murmured into his ear. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. Sebastian held him tightly, his grip firm and unwavering. Together, he echoed, his voice a vow that resonated through the quiet night air. And as they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, Jared knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them side by side. For the first time, he felt certain that this was where he was meant to be, in this man's arms, building a future that was theirs and theirs alone. Sebastian stayed over that night, the weight of his family's disapproval hanging heavily between them. As they lay in bed, Jared turned to face him. You don't have to do this alone, you know, he whispered. Sebastian shook his head, a determined glint in his eyes. I need to, he replied softly. I need to show them that I've made my choice, that I'm not backing down. Jared reached out, taking Sebastian's hand. Then do it, and I'll be here when you get back. The next day, Sebastian left for his family's home. Hours felt like days as Jared waited, anxiety clawing at his chest. By evening, he heard the door creak open. Sebastian stepped in, his eyes tired yet hopeful. They didn't take it well, he said, voice trembling. But I told them I love you, and I'm not changing my mind. Relief washed over Jared as he crossed the room, pulling Sebastian into a tight embrace. I'm proud of you, he murmured. For being honest with them and with yourself. Sebastian hugged him back, burying his face in Jared's shoulder. It's going to be tough, he admitted, his voice wavering. But as long as we're together, we'll make it. Jared pulled back slightly, meeting his gaze. Together, he echoed, a small smile forming. No more running. We face everything from here on, side by side. Sebastian nodded, a spark of hope lighting up his eyes. Side by side, he agreed. And as they held each other, Jared felt a calm settle over him. This was their story, messy, imperfect, but real. With each other, they were ready to face whatever came next. Together.